Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to get into a video over the Battle of the Somme. This is a video that was recommended forever ago. I mean, months and months and months ago. I hadn't gotten to it since the last video I did was the Sabaton and Motorhead song over basically this topic. I figured that I would go ahead and throw it in here. I talked about it in that video. World War I is probably the most intriguing historical war to me. I love to read and study about it. It has a million different interesting topics and threads. So I'm curious to see how this goes. I've never done a video by this channel before. It's called Wars of the World, I believe. So let's jump into it and check them out.
Before the world grew mad, the Somme was a placid stream of Picardy, flowing gently through a broad and winding valley, northwards to the English Channel. It watered a country of simple beauty. Then came the pestilence. A.D. Gristwood. In 1916, France was a nation cut in two by a string of trenches cut into the earth, running from north to south, separating two vast opposing military forces who fielded weapons that seemed the stuff of science fiction only one generation before. So confident in these weapons were both sides that they expected the fighting to be a short and sharp affair, both expecting victory, but in the end, it was nothing more than a bloody, senseless stalemate. Britain had gone to war in honor of a treaty it had signed with Belgium, which German Kaiser Wilhelm II disregarded when his troops invaded the small neutral country, looking to bypass the main French line.
Yeah, I've talked about this in a couple of other videos. I'm not entirely convinced that's the actual reason why Britain went to war here. Obviously, it's the reason that they give. It's the thing that drags them into it. I don't know if France steps foot on Belgian territory before Germany does. I don't think Britain's invading France or you know what I mean? Like I feel like it's specific to Germany. And so I'm not entirely convinced that's the whole story about why they joined the war, but it is the reason that's given.
At the time, the British Empire was the most powerful in history, but that strength lay largely in its navy. On the continent, professional troops used to putting down uprisings by tribesmen in the remote parts of the empire struggled to get to grips with the realities of modern warfare.
Yeah, what's Bismarck's quote about if the BEF comes over? He says if they do that, I'll have them arrested. You know, I'll send them, the cops out there to round them up and throw them in jail. They were not there. The BEF was not very highly thought of. The Royal Navy absolutely was.
Result was a bloodbath and would eventually lead to the bloodiest day in the history of the British Army, the first day of the Battle of the Somme. Welcome to Wars of the World. Your country needs you. So proclaims the caricature of Lord Horatio Kitchener on countless posters that soon adorned shops, post offices, train stations, and anywhere that young, fit men might congregate en masse.
Yeah, Kitchener was a larger-than-life figure, and he is sort of the face used for recruiting. Eventually, he'll get a group together that's known as Kitchener's Army of these new recruits, and he kind of tries to protect them for as long as he can, seeing obviously the bloodbath that all of these recruits are running into.
The Great War ignited something in the population of Great Britain that had not been seen in the memory of those alive to witness its outbreak. Such was the drive to do one's bit in the service of King George V and the country over which he reigned, that when Kitchener asked for 100,000 volunteers to bolster the professional army, he found himself with 500,000 eager young men, the cream of the British crop, rushing to join up. Many signed up on the promise of being allowed to serve in one of the countless new regiments being formed, whose members heralded from the same towns and cities, creating an instant camaraderie and giving them distinct identities carried over from civilian life, the so-called PALS battalions. The war on the continent marked a radical departure for Britain's military posture in 1914. As an island nation and possessing the most powerful navy in the world, British policy to European conflicts towards the end of the Victorian era was often to simply let the neighbours fight it out, while the powerful Royal Navy made sure such fighting never crossed the English Channel. Now,
Yeah, and they were very accustomed to using their navy and their money, to be honest. You see that a lot throughout the history leading up to World War One. They get involved, like during the Napoleonic era, but they really try to swing things just using the navy and money. They don't really use troops, hardly ever.
with Britain being taken into an unprecedented land war on the continent, it was having to play catch-up on its mobilization. Having 500,000 volunteers eager to get stuck in was a good start. But the established British Army support network simply couldn't cope with suddenly having to clothe, arm, and train them. Many of these new regiments found themselves being taught drill routines in their own civilian clothes, using walking sticks to stand in for rifles. Some units didn't even see a real rifle until a week or two before deploying to France.
Jesus.
Setting off for the continent, this new British army of patriots left behind cheering crowds, whom they promised it would all be over by Christmas. Christmas 1914 came, but without an end in sight. Christmas 1915 came with similarly little prospect of peace, while for thousands of families, the details of their son's last moments on Earth came in the form of a telegram informing them that he had been killed in battle. Volunteer rates plummeted by late 1915, despite a growing stigma at home concerning those fit enough to join up and fight but had yet to do so, prompting the British government to reluctantly introduce conscription in early 1916. Peering at the British build-up from across the divide of the trenches that cut France in two was the chief of the German Great General Staff, Erich von Falkenhayn. Analyzing the Central Powers' entire strategic picture at the start of 1916, he reasoned that Britain was now Germany's #1 arch-enemy, and the biggest threat to the Kaiser's ambitions on the continent and beyond. The war in the East against an increasingly unstable Russia was still going largely their way, while on the southern front, Italian efforts over the Alps against predominantly Austro-Hungarian troops had stalled. France.
Yeah, the shackled to a corpse, tethered to a corpse quote that's given in Germany at the time is certainly the reality of the situation, at least in my opinion. The Austro-Hungarian army is brutal in this war. I mean, it is. I talked about this in a comment on one of the last couple of videos, but you look at the Ottomans and you look at the Austro-Hungarians, maybe it's just because there's more expectations of the Austro-Hungarians going into it, but as bad as they both fight in different ways, the Austro-Hungarians just stick out in my mind as being so brutal. And I feel like shackled to a corpse is the perfect phrase of what the Austro-Hungarian force is at this time. I mean, just so brutal.
France, he reckoned, lacked the stomach to continue the bloodshed much longer, but Britain still had her mighty navy, was still building up her army, including troops from her empire, and was able to produce the materials for war on an industrial scale, thanks to imports of raw materials by sea. He therefore suggested to Kaiser Wilhelm II that in order to achieve victory in 1916, the first step would be for the Imperial German Navy to instigate a policy of unrestricted U-boat warfare, destroying as many ships approaching Britain as possible to prevent the materials for war reaching Britain's factories, and possibly even starving the British population into submission by sinking food shipments. He then proposed an early German offensive ahead of the expected Anglo-French summer offensives against a target he knew the French would feel compelled to throw everything they had into repelling. The offensive would effectively act as bait to lure in as many French troops as possible to an artillery kill zone established by German forces where they could be pummeled into oblivion.
Yeah, so this is in reference to Verdun, and I feel like this is as far as the ideas or general plans for a battle going into it are in World War I, because a lot of them I feel like are just terrible, right? I talked about this in the last video. It's generals doing the same thing over and over, going over the top, having troops get mowed down, losing a ton of men, and you kind of just see it over and over and over and over again. Verdun is actually sort of a ruthlessly devious plan, and I feel like it is a real understanding of what this modern warfare has become. And as brutal as it is, and as, bleed France white is the game plan, like, yeesh. But as brutal as that is, and as brutal as it sounds, I feel like that is the first real, comprehension on a large scale that, this is the type of war we're fighting.
Having bled the French army to death, their line would begin to crumble, allowing either an actual breakout, or in the best case scenario, forcing the French to enter negotiations. Either way, the Germans could then focus on a British army that was being increasingly starved of both supplies and French support, and was, on paper, outnumbered by the Germans on the Western Front. Falkenhayn selected the fortress at Verdun for his assault, knowing it had special meaning to the French for its historic significance, and after receiving the Kaiser's blessing, he attacked on February 21st, 1916. Further increasing the seemingly almost climactic significance of the battle, the attack was spearheaded by the German Fifth Army, commanded by the Crown Prince Wilhelm, the Kaiser's own son. As Falkenhayn predicted, the French committed themselves to the battle, refusing to hand over a single inch of soil without making the German army pay in blood. However, Falkenhayn's placement of his field guns on three sides around Verdun meant they were as brutally effective as planned. For weeks, the French army's body count continued to rise as they held out, but as the battle showed no signs of stopping, it was obvious to everyone that it could not be continued indefinitely. Thus, pressure was mounting on the British to launch their own offensive against the German line, with the intention of easing the burden on the French.
And you see this constantly in World War I, when one side is getting hammered in a specific area, they basically reach out to all of the other partners and say, hey, attack somebody, do something, launch an offensive somewhere, so that they'll have to pull troops away from where they're killing us, and it'll relieve the situation some. This happens pretty consistently throughout the war.
The German assault on Verdun had, as Falkenhayn predicted, upset Allied plans for a big push in the summer. Recently appointed as commander of the British Expeditionary Force, General Douglas Haig had anticipated the launching of his offensive sometime in August, by which time most of those conscripted in Britain would have finished their training and been shipped out to plug gaps in the BEF's strength. This big push would be launched in Ypres, Belgium, in conjunction with the French, who, fighting on home soil, would again bear much of the burden. Now, however, French General Philippe Pétain was having to hold back much of his army to continue the slaughter around Verdun, and was increasingly viewing his British allies with disdain for apparently just sitting on their hands while his men were dying. The plan changed, therefore, for the British and French to launch their assault in the Somme region in Picardy, as this was where both armies converged along the Allied line. The region itself held little strategic value, and so had been relatively quiet in the months prior. This afforded the Germans the opportunity to construct more elaborate defenses to hold the line, with as few troops as possible in order to focus their effort on Verdun. But Haig was confident that the massive artillery barrage he planned in advance of the offensive would obliterate these before his troops got anywhere near them. With the need to relieve pressure on the Verdun, the offensive was pushed forward to begin in early July.
Again, this is one of those plans where it's just more artillery. Like, you see this over and over and over during the war. More artillery does not mean you're going to get everybody. It doesn't matter how big the artillery strike is, there's going to be troops left. So when you go over the top, there's going to be troops there. This is, again, when I was saying about how you kind of watch the same plan play out over and over and over. And it's easy to see why some of the contemporary writers and veterans and historians and things of that nature were not very happy with their military leadership.
It would also now have to take place with just 11 French divisions, far fewer than was originally planned, meaning for the first time, the BEF was going to be the major player. Haig's plan called for the British Third Army, under Lieutenant General Edmund Allenby, and the Fourth Army, formed just 4 months before, under the command of Lieutenant General Sir Henry Rawlinson, to open the campaign by attacking and seizing the German frontline trenches, then pushing on to the second-line trenches, and then pushing forward. Supporting the British to the south would be the French Sixth Army, which would strike on both sides of the Somme River. Haig envisioned a breakthrough of the shell-blasted German lines, after which both the British and French could reorganize and strike out en masse. If all went well, Haig hoped that this time, finally, the war would be over by Christmas. However, Rawlinson, whose Fourth Army would be doing the bulk of the fighting, had a different view of the impending battle. Based on his experience of the war already, he thought such a breakthrough was unrealistic, and instead wanted to adopt the more cautious but slower bite and hold approach. His men would attack a specific German position, capture it, hold it against an inevitable counterattack, while artillery softened up the next objective where the tactic was repeated, chipping away at the German lines. Rawlinson knew that with no actual, tangible objective in the Somme region, the real purpose of the offensive was to kill Germans, and this was, in his mind, the soundest way to do so, with the minimum risk to his own men. Given these fundamental differences of opinion, it's hard to fathom why the question of just how the Fourth Army was to conduct itself was not fully resolved by the end of June 1916. Haig allowed Rawlinson to handle the finer details of the advance himself, meaning he could adopt his bite and hold tactic, but Haig still insisted on his breakthrough, leaving Rawlinson to adhere to it in spirit, if not necessarily in practice. These contradictions in planning, understandably, led to confusion among the corps commanders beneath them. The situation was made worse by Rawlinson, who felt that some of the new army units he was fielding comprised thousands of inexperienced young men, barely out of...
Yeah, and this is not just the commanders. You have... So the BEF, when the war starts, is extremely small. I mean, like, extremely small. However, they have units in it that are well-known, hardened vet units. You know, they have a real army, as small as it is. Those are real troops, okay? Once you start having the newer troops come in and replace and build up essentially the rest of the numbers, a lot of the older troops, you know, you can see it in their writings. They're like, Jesus, these guys are going to get themselves killed, if not me killed. Like, they're trying to do everything they can to sort of help these new guys along. But this is a very unforgiving world that they're living in. And the veteran BEF troops very much recognize how dangerous this is for everybody involved. And it's not just the British, by the way. Everybody runs into this problem of having new green troops come in I talked in the Sabaton video last about the massacre of the innocents. That's what the battle's called. Um, where on the German side you have all these new young green troops that come in and just get absolutely mowed down. It's sort of the reality of the situation for everybody, but yeah, it's rough here at the Somme.
Of basic training who wouldn't be able to cope with a complex battle plan. He therefore decided that the infantry should, where possible, march towards the enemy positions in steady waves rather than a charging assault so as to keep the advance coordinated. This naturally led to concerns regarding their vulnerability to machine gun fire, but these were dismissed by Rawlinson since he was assured by Haig that with 1,537 guns pounding away at the German positions for a week in advance, not even a rat would be left alive on the Germans' side of no man's land. The Somme region was originally held predominantly by the French army until the men of the British Expeditionary Force began to take it over. Upon examining their new battlefield, the British commanders discovered that given the prior bloodshed experienced by both sides, it seemed as though both the French and German troops stationed on the front lines had adopted an unofficial policy of live and let live. Action was, wherever possible, avoided in order to not waste troops in skirmishes, so that as many were left fighting fit as possible when they made their next big push.
And you see this in a handful of different places and all throughout the war. Even if it's not on a larger scale, you see it on much smaller scales where a part of the line, is flooded by rain, or there's just some situation where it's sort of really shitty for everyone involved. And you see this sort of live and let live, this idea of like, we're both in a bad spot. We have to do something to get out of this on our own. So like, we won't shoot at you for a little bit and let you do your thing, and you don't shoot at us for a little bit and let us do our thing.
However, this flew in the face of the British opinion that demanded the enemy be harassed at every given opportunity, if not for practical terms, then certainly psychological ones, promoting a natural aggression and hatred for the Germans in their own troops, while at the same time hoping to discourage similar German activity. The arrival of the British saw a dramatic increase in the shelling of German positions in the Somme before the summer of 1916, while the best shots in each of the platoons manning the frontline trenches were given free rein to shoot at any German foolish enough to make himself known to them. Naturally, this lent itself to the Germans responding in kind, leading to deadly battles of nerves between snipers on both sides trying to get the angle on the other. Darkness brought little respite. With there being no effective way of seeing in the dark, save for star shells briefly illuminating the ground as they fell to earth, it was only truly viable to venture out of the trenches at night. Raiding teams were often sent out to harry the enemy trenches and take reconnaissance of the area, helping to build a bigger picture of what they might expect to encounter when the attack finally came. By the same token, it also afforded them the opportunity to repair their own defenses. In preparation for the offensive, additional field artillery was brought into the region to meet Haig's desire to pummel the Germans' first trench line into submission before his infantry went over the top, including 400 heavy artillery guns operating alongside the French artillery. This meant the coming battle was set to be opened by one of the most intense bombardments in history. However, they would not be expected to do the job alone. Given that the German positions were on a higher elevation than the British front lines, it was decided to tunnel underneath them, where large mines could be placed and then detonated as the attack was about to commence. 19 separate tunnels were dug to the German positions by British tunneling teams, whose ranks often consisted of men who hailed from Britain's various coal mining communities and who had...
Yeah, this is on Peaky Blinders. This is the main character, his sort of group were tunnelers that fought at the Somme. These guys were... They actually do a good job in that show of sort of showing how everybody in the military reacts whenever they are told that they're tunnelers, because that really is sort of how they were seen. Like, it's such a rough job. It's such bad conditions, everything about it. And there are just horror stories about, when it was actually happening that yeah, they are sort of notorious. The tunnelers are. And again, with the idea of the huge guns and just bombing for a week, it seems like with every offensive, the amount of bombs that are dropped, the amount of shells are just more and more and more and more and more. And you use different kinds of shells, and you're going after trenches and going after barbed wire and all this stuff. And yet it doesn't matter. Like at the end of the shelling, when the troops come out and go over the top, there's going to be machine gun fire coming back. That's sort of start to see a response to that with things like the creeping barrage, where the guns are more or less just blocking view and keeping heads down, and the troops that are in the trenches on the side of the guns that are firing are sort of following this line of gunfire. So all of the shells are firing in a line, and the troops are right behind that line. And then the guns go further and further and further out, and it sort of masks the incoming troops as they come in. That's one of the things that's done to kind of counter this, to try to do something different, because yeah, as far as just dropping more and more and more shells, the reality is there's going to be machine gun fire on the other side.
Had extensive experience working underground. While the tunneling units worked secretly underground, on June 24th, 1916, the preparatory bombardment began. Over the coming week, the British guns would fire a staggering 1.7 million shells onto the German positions. Given the immense noise of the barrage carrying across no man's land, many of the British troops, even the more experienced ones who had fought the earlier terrible battles of the previous 2 years and were generally more cynical than the eager Pals battalions, began to believe that nothing could survive such an onslaught. Confidence, and with it morale, went soaring. The men of the East Surrey Regiment were amused to find that one of their officers, Captain Wilfred Neville, produced a pair of leather-skinned footballs, which he intended to have his men kick into the German trenches. On the other side of no man's land, the German troops took cover in their shelters as the shells landed around them. Despite being the invaders, German trenches often offered far superior protection than their British or French counterparts.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The Germans were not playing on their trenches. They had almost like barrack or housing units underground that were, it's insane the stuff the Germans have. So I hope he goes into it some.
With some German trenches on the Somme having dugouts 10 meters deep in order to protect their soldiers from incoming artillery fire. One of the reasons for this disparity was that the British commanders wanted resources focused more on attack rather than holding the line and maintaining the bloody stalemate.
Yeah, well, and on the British side, they're like, well, we're not going to be here long. That's the general thought process is we're not going to be here long. There's no reason for us to, bring in wood and concrete and all that and make this up, because real soon we're going to be in their trenches, and then we'll have all that anyway. So we're not going to be here long enough that we'll really need that. The Germans just went all out with their trench networks.
Yet the psychological trauma of hearing and feeling the earth blasted away around them took a heavy toll on many German soldiers' nerves. The intense shelling also did something else. It alerted the Germans that the British and French were ready to attack, allowing them to make their own preparations. However, research for a BBC documentary aired in 2016 now appears to show that the Germans were forewarned already, thanks to the capture of 2 disgruntled British soldiers in the weeks leading up to the start of July, although just how much information they would have been able to provide is debatable. The Germans also had successfully intercepted uncoded wireless and even telephone calls between British units, revealing key information about the impending attack. As July 1st crept ever closer, British troops were still sent out on reconnaissance missions to no man's land at night. There they discovered to their horror that the expected destruction of the German defenses, in particular the miles of barbed wire, just wasn't taking place despite the intense bombardment. This naturally led to some unease amongst the troops manning the line, including Captain Neville, who had undertaken such personal reconnaissance missions, leading to the speculation that his football idea was part of an effort to calm his men's nerves. A number of factors had been conspiring to reduce the bombardment's effectiveness. Firstly, the guns were spread too thinly to effectively saturate a targeted area, with some parts of the German lines coming off relatively unscathed. Secondly, the type of shells the British were using were designed to spread shrapnel over large areas, which was ideal for killing or maiming formations of soldiers out in the open, but not so when it came to destroying lines of barbed wire or
Yep, or getting troops underground. It's that's a big one. The specific type of shell that was being used was basically giant frag grenades, right? And you think like, wow, that's for a war like this, that could be really useful in certain circumstances. But then in other circumstances, that will literally just be really loud noises. Like it's not going to take out barbed wire. You know, I mean, that shell would have to land so perfectly, but the shrapnel itself is not going to take out barbed wire all up and down the line. It's just the reality of the situation. It's the reality of the shells that they were using. Yeah, as they get closer and closer to actually, you know, starting the main offensive, there are definitely signs that the situation is different than they thought going into it. I think I'm going to go ahead and stop it here, break this up into two so that I don't have an hour and a half long video. If anybody has anything that they want to comment, add, questions, anything like that, you can put it down in the comment section below. I'll have the Discord link in the description box down below if you want to jump over there. Yeah, I'll finish the rest of this. Actually, I'll probably just finish it right now. I need to go work, but I'll probably just finish it. But it'll be out either later this afternoon or tomorrow. The second half of this will be. So be on the lookout. As always, like, comment, subscribe. Help me keep building the channel over here. And I will see you all next time.